Super Supreme, 9 great toppings, ain't no stopping, ooey gooey good. Super Supreme. At Pizza Hut, and nothing but.
Every time somebody says Sorcerer Supreme, makes me really hungry. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. It's hard to believe it's been nearly a decade since the animated Doctor Strange movie was released in 2007. I remember thinking that was a pretty bold choice, considering how relatively little known that character was at the time. And that's compared to Iron Man then, which is another character that animation team tried their hand at previously to dismal and embarrassing results, according to everyone I've ever talked to who has seen it. I still haven't tackled that one. Remember, the big budget Iron Man film was still a year away at this point, and no one had any inkling that superheroes en masse were about to become the towering money-making juggernaut Westerns once were, much less that in the not-too-distant future, the characters Marvel and Lionsgate were adapting to the small screen would become part of a multi-billion-dollar shared universe. Fans who were keeping up with Iron Man's production would have known that's what Marvel Studios was hoping for, but the world at large wasn't remotely prepared for it, and no one could have predicted the A-list status Iron Man was about to achieve, much less that 9 years later, Doctor Strange would get the same big-budget treatment. The fourth in Marvel's direct-to-video animated movie series, preceded by Invincible Iron Man and the two Ultimate Avengers movies, this was about adapting a cult favorite character for his fans and introducing him to the curious, rather than cashing in on the popularity of an already profitable superhero, which, as with Ultimate Avengers, I question the logic of a little. It's an animated movie, not airing on TV or released in theaters, intended for a more adult audience. The demographic of people who might watch this and aren't already familiar with the character is really limited. Though unlike with the Avengers, I can somewhat see the wisdom in beginning with Origin, since Doctor Strange is a more obscure character than most of the Avengers, even for the comic reading community, and even in 2007. It came out the same year that DC started its line of DVD-only releases with Superman Doomsday, and because they've, on the whole, been more widely discussed, I always have to remind myself that Marvel's came first and that DC was following suit, rather than starting something brand new. Both lines were primarily aimed at adults. Both sets of movies were all PG-13, until more recently when DC finally put out an R-rated feature with The Killing Joke, and both sometimes adapted specific story arcs, like The Death of Superman or The Ultimates, and sometimes produced original stories with some influences from particular arcs. And early on, both were open to taking chances on less proven solo properties. Marvel had Doctor Strange, DC had Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, which are, of course, much more widely known properties, but for the last several years, DC has been unwilling to release anything that doesn't have Justice League, Batman, or Superman in the titles, though they're finally about to lift that embargo with Teen Titans, the Judas Contract. It was commendable to see Marvel trying to educate its fans with their entertainment, encouraging them to try things apart from what they were most used to have sold to them. But again, I don't know how successful an experiment that proved to be with this movie format. The only people I've talked to who have seen this were familiar with Doctor Strange in the first place. I could cut and paste a lot of what I said about the first Ultimate Avengers movie into this review. It feels like a pilot for a potentially great TV series, but it's lackluster on its own since it's mostly set up. I don't know that I would have put that mention of Clea at the end without being sure I was getting another one. And it's a little worse here. At least Ultimate Avengers had a sequel. It also suffers, like Ultimate Avengers, from not adapting more of its source material straight. Some of the mythology feels watered down before it feels like a fresh new way to update the lead Ditko origin. I think a lot of what's changed here is because it doesn't think a modern-day audience will accept Stephen Strange for the unlikable jerkface he is in the comics before he becomes a sorcerer, and because it's not confident enough in the driving force of the action in typical Doctor Strange stories to carry an animated feature. And also, like the other movies in this line, there's some decent to excellent cartoon action, some strong dialogue writing, and it earns its adult rating without pandering to that audience with forced swearing or violence. It's not an especially memorable film, but there's some poignancy to its discussion about mortality and guilt, and what we can accomplish if we accept our limitations. A lot of fans familiar with both characters tend to relate Stephen Strange, before he becomes the master of mysticism, with Robert Downey's Tony Stark. The textbook narcissist is a lot closer to what Strange is in the origin than comic book Iron Man. He only cares about money and recognition and won't help anyone unless he's being paid for it. Just as Tony Stark in the first Iron Man movie isn't paying any attention to the consequences of his weapons, Doctor Strange doesn't care who he's helping or who he's not. After he cripples his hands in a car crash, loses everything because he refuses to be subordinate to anyone, he winds up a washed-up street urchin. Desperate and with nothing to lose, he goes to the often whispered about Ancient One, who recognizes his self-absorption but also sees a goodness inside Stephen that he can't see himself. And once Stephen accepts something larger than himself, the powers of black magic, the Ancient One helps him to find his true self, which he's lost. The animated film sort of does all that, but it attempts to make Strange more relatable from the get-go. I appreciate the effort in trying to bring more depth to the man before his transformation. In Strange Tales number 115, he's just a stuck-up rich guy. The movie decides he's too unfeeling for that not to come from some kind of a play. In the movies, Tony Stark may be all about himself, and it may take a lot to prove to anyone that he has a heart, but he's not ignoring that his weapons are being used by terrorist groups and letting people die. He's just so in his own world he's oblivious to it. It takes his experience in the cave when terrorists try to force him to make weapons for them to open his eyes. That's the big difference between comic Strange and movie Stark. One starts out heartless, the other oblivious. And so this movie tries to explain his heartlessness with another tragic backstory. Well before he loses his hands, he loses his sister on his operating table, shortly after he gets his license to practice neurosurgery. And ever since then, he's either lost his ability to care, as Dr. Atwater puts it, or he pretends like he doesn't care so he doesn't relive that pain every time he tries to save someone and fails. I'm not sure which it is, and the movie is real ambiguous about it. I do appreciate the subtlety. It tries to present most of its ideas through narrative action rather than spoon-feeding its audience with forced exposition. But how Strange goes from totally well-adjusted, but certainly still really into himself, to cold and ostensibly money-grubbing is unclear. He refuses to treat children, he's only interested in hopeless cases, and only cases that, as he tells Atwater, a medical journal would be interested in. It seems to me like he's putting on an air of condescension, but it's really a defense mechanism. But I don't have enough information to be sure because I'm not in his head enough, and because I can't infer as much from this animated performance as I might a good live-action actor. Maybe he just lost himself after his sister died and he really doesn't care what happens to anyone else. But it plays more to me like he's punishing himself, especially since the main hurdle he has to jump through when he's mentored by the Ancient One is accepting that his sister could not be saved. Perhaps he's only operating on hopeless cases because he knows there's nothing he can do from the outset. He's lost that optimism he had when he thought he could save his sister from whatever unnamed brain disease she had, and would rather fail every time and know he couldn't have done anything, rather than operate on someone who might be saved and risk reliving his sister's case all over again. If that's what's going on, I imagine he won't treat children not because he doesn't care about kids, but because he can't bring himself to see a child die in his arms like his kid sister did. This is why, generally speaking, surgeons probably shouldn't operate on family members. That would be a potentially believable reason for him to act that way, but then in that case, Doctor Strange isn't a horrible scumbag of a human being like he is at first in the comics. He's a guy who's just pretending to be that way. And the only reason to make him like that in the first place is to be faithful to the source material. It seems more plausible that this guy would have just stopped practicing medicine. In the comics, it reads like karma gets him. You're a natural-born healer who heals only for yourself. Fine, car crash. You don't deserve your hands, so poof, they're gone. And then he has to want them back, not for himself, but for the sake of helping the world. I don't know if this is the story of a man who loses his hands to learn how to care about the good he can do with them again, or if it's about a man who squandered his gift because of his self-doubt and guilt, and who has to regain his self-confidence in order to take the risk of failing and to try to help people again. There's a poetic justice to Stephen losing his fortune to the very same sort of experimental medicine he practices, paying an arm and a hand for tests and attempted surgeries that never improve his condition, but bleed him dry anyway. I need to understand why he's doing that to people to fully appreciate his having it done to him. It's interesting if I'm right, because it's nearly the opposite character arc from that 8-page Strange Tales origin. Stephen has to learn confidence rather than humility. Although I suppose there's some of that too. Both are men who want to be in control at all times and have to learn about their limitations before they're worthy of great power. Not unlike the responsibility lesson Peter Parker learns, except He figures that out through his power, and Strange has to earn his based on a similar lesson. But there's definitely more evidence to support the second read. Once Stephen goes to Tibet, it watches a lot like the first act of Batman Begins. Stephen has to overcome his guilt, just like Bruce Wayne, to realize there was nothing he could have done to save the person he lost, and that it's not his fault she's gone. But unlike Batman Begins, it's not about overcoming and redirecting fear, and at the risk of looking too much like that movie just 2 years later, perhaps that should have been at the forefront. It would be interesting if what most represents Stephen's fear is his hands. He's afraid to try to help people, so instead, he takes advantage of them. Then he loses them, then he has to embrace that fear, accepting what he can't control before he can get them back again. The movie is dangerously close to all of that, but there's not enough there for me to confidently say that's going on, especially to say for sure that he's not supposed to be cold and heartless at the beginning. I don't mean to force the puzzle pieces together. It's more like I'm missing a key piece and trying to imagine what the puzzle would look like if I suddenly found it on the floor and could put it back in. The movie tries to create a cohesive journey for Stephen based on what he's lost, rather than taking him through a series of disconnected and generic platitudes, which is a trap I'd expect from an animated video feature like this. I like that everything he's made to do in Tibet, as Karate Kid as it is symbolic of or related to what he's going through and the personal hurdles he needs to overcome. It's a real lesson in accepting the things you can't change and finding the strength to change the things you can, rather than a bunch of fortune cookie mumbo-jumbo. And I like that we don't know what it's all about until Stephen comes to understand it. The Ancient One decides to build a wall and makes Stephen pay for it, over and over again. We find out later that the wall represents the one the Ancient One says Stephen has built for himself out of pain and regret. The wall is both painful to build and painful to knock down, and he has to commit to not building that wall inside himself if he's to learn the secret to his innate magical powers. The Ancient One says he has to accept the unacceptable, which I think is both about accepting those things he thought were impossible, like making a sword out of thin air, but also those things he doesn't want to accept, like the fact that his sister couldn't be saved. He can't realize his power if he can't also realize his limitations. Like Professor Xavier in Days of Future Past, his self-doubt holds him back, and it's only when he understands he can't control everything, like Xavier tried to control Mystique, that he can gain back the ability to control what is in his power. Stephen's hands work as a similar motif as Tony Stark's heart in the Marvel Studios movies. Tony finds his sense of compassion through physically rebuilding his heart. Doctor Strange has to learn what things are, as the Ancient One says, out of his hands before he regains the use of them, before he realizes what he does have power over. However, because so much of Doctor Strange's lore is thrown into the origin here, rather than getting that out of the way early and then telling a story with a fully realized Strange, the plot itself doesn't come together as well as Stephen's training. It hinges on some big contrivances and easy timing. Mordo's team of mystic Power Rangers fights a big monster, and they use a spell so no one sees it, to keep the world of magic hidden from simple-minded mortals, I guess. Doctor Strange is there, and Wong notices that he sees through the spell, indicating a natural mystical gift. And it's maybe a little convenient that he happens to be there. I'm not totally sure why Wong waits until Stephen ruins his hands and exhausts his entire fortune looking for a cure before he tries to recruit him. This does give Stephen an incentive to train and realize his power, but doesn't the Ancient One need all the help he can get? It isn't all about Doctor Strange. Conveniently, they find Strange at the same time as the Dread Dormammu, the ultimate evil being, made entirely of corrupted magic, who's getting really strong and maybe about to break free of the Dark Dimension, where the Ancient One trapped him eons ago. Wong and the Ancient One don't know how powerful Doctor Strange might become, and I don't think they intend for him to take the Ancient One's place as the Sorcerer Supreme from the beginning. But they're playing it like business as usual with Doctor Strange. Meanwhile, Mordo is out with his army fighting a war against Dormammu's super creepy monsters. I don't mean to say the Ancient One should rush Stephen's training. He has to help Stephen fundamentally change his attitude about the world and his place in it. In the comics, it takes Doctor Strange years to master the mystic arts. Because we kill off the Ancient One in the origin and Stephen has to take his place, he goes from pathetic student lying on a bare floor to Sorcerer Supreme in the time it takes US soldiers to go through basic training. But it does seem convenient that Wong would wait around for Strange to have an accident and get desperate for the magician's help. Unless he knows the future and is waiting for that particular moment in history, he seems to just do that because that's when it needs to happen in the story. And it seems easy that Doctor Strange is found and trained just as the world is about to need another Sorcerer Supreme. After all, Mordo would almost certainly have turned Judas and joined forces with Dormammu against the Ancient One, regardless of Stephen's involvement. Mordo hates Stephen for being groomed as the next Sorcerer Supreme. He wants the job, and that's, of course, why he can't have it. It's your standard absolute power principle. Mordo craves the power, so he isn't qualified to wield it. And Stephen is, because while he was only out for himself before, it wasn't about grand ambition, it was about his guilt. And a self-assured Doctor Strange is a healer, not a destroyer. I like the exchange he and Mordo have during their last training session together, when Mordo says, "Have you never held a blade?" and Stephen says he has, but only to heal, never to hurt. And Mordo is a mirror for Doctor Strange, the embodiment of what Stephen might have been were he as arrogant and unfeeling as he seemed before he lost his hands and wielding great power. But it's not like Mordo would have become Sorcerer Supreme if Stephen hadn't shown up. I imagine it might have gone to Wong, and we'd have exactly the same scenario, except when Mordo killed the Ancient One, it would be up to someone else with the Eye of Agamotto to stop Dormammu. By the way, although it's an archetype we've seen 1,000 times in superhero fiction, there's a little more to Mordo here than in the initial comic origin. There, the Ancient One knows Mordo is evil, even knows Mordo's sending evil spirits after him and weakening him, but he says he keeps him close so he can control him. Here, Mordo is Sinestro, believing himself to be the best and obvious choice to lead, ultimately betraying his sacred duty to fulfill his thirst for power. I like the idea that power has corrupted Mordo, and he's lost sight of what the magicians are about. I get the sense he might have been a good man at one time, but he's lost his way. The Ancient One says they're protectors, not soldiers, and he ends up seeing his fellow sorcerers as so expendable after getting a bunch of them killed that he doesn't even care what side is in charge, so long as he gets to be Sorcerer Supreme. One of the big things that makes the timing so convenient is that only Doctor Strange has the ability to turn someone's magic against them, which is what it takes to defeat Dormammu. It wouldn't feel so contrived if Stephen's presence was the catalyst for more of this initially. I do really like the way Dormammu comes across dimensional planes. We learn that children, through their vast imaginations, have a window into other dimensions, and they sometimes tap into that when dreaming. So Dormammu is pulling a Freddy Krueger and getting into their minds, forcing them into a coma, and then trying to come through their dreams. I guess the more of them he puts in comas, the easier it is for him to come through. At the beginning, Stephen found out about the comas and refused to look into it because he doesn't take on child patients. And Dr. Atwater already has this huge brain problem situation, dozens of kids on her hands, before he reluctantly finally even agrees to listen to her dilemma.
I think maybe, but I don't know, but I'm starting to feel like I got a brain problem situation on my hands. I think maybe, but I don't know, but I'm starting to feel like I got a brain problem situation on my hands.
I like that he's looking at the work of a huge mystical force here and doesn't know it. And that's not too convenient because every hospital in the city has coma wards filled with children Dormammu has gotten to. Dormammu's plot links everything with Doctor Strange together. He gets in his car wreck because he keeps sharing one of the child's dreams of Dormammu, and by the end, he has to help these children he wasn't initially interested in at all in order to save the world. I like that the source of his ultimate redemption is the subject of his reprehensible behavior at the beginning that led to his losing his hands in the first place. Although he may have still had the Dormammu visions and still gotten in that wreck even if he agreed to help. I think what hurts this is a Doctor Strange movie most is the story excuse for typical superhero action. A lot of the trappings of what makes Doctor Strange are there. Infinite dimensions all existing in the same physical space, the Sanctum Sanctorum, the Eye of Agamotto, the mystical symbol in the window, even the weird Steve Ditko hand gestures when Strange is casting spells. Various magicians have their own power, like the one who can make trees grow and ride them. But instead of incantations and weird magic spells, most of the action is reduced to sword fighting, which feels boring because it makes these characters seem unimaginative. In a scene that reminded me a lot of the Matrix Kung Fu training sequence, the Ancient One tells Stephen that anything he can perceive will exist, and anything he does not perceive will not exist. You think that's air you're breathing now? Well, yeah, it is, but you can turn it into a sword. It's a good metaphor for controlling his emotions, certainly. He is only as inadequate as he perceives himself to be, beyond those things that are simply out of his mortal control. But as the foundational rule for the magic of this world, it breaks down. The Ancient One tells Stephen he can create a sword out of thin air because matter is simply energy, and energy is all around us. Okay, But how far does that go? Is it like the Force, where lifting an X-Wing is as easy as lifting a rock if you don't think of it in terms of weight and difficulty? Can you create anything with that energy? If so, why are these magicians mostly just making weapons they could just as easily carry around with them? Why fight an opponent when you could just create a steel box around it and suck all the air out? And if it's as simple as if you don't perceive something, it's not there, couldn't they just unperceive the monsters out of existence? While some of these designs are quite good, the Sanctum Sanctorum and other dimensions are sufficiently surreal, and I really like Doctor Strange's sleek black and red cloak, I found it hard not to want to see this movie with Jack Kirby's designs after all the Kirby pictures were teased with in the closing credits. Oh, and I should mention, that's why I've been able to publish more reviews lately. The problem was, I wasn't perceiving them, so they weren't there. I just started perceiving Superhero Rewind, and there it was. It's that easy. I'm going to start a motivational speaking series. I'll call it Critique Through the Power of Perception, discovering your opinion by way of instantaneous self-actualization. I wonder if I can get colleges to invite me to come speak. I like the somber tone and the mysterious atmosphere of this movie, especially during the first half, and there's some surprisingly human moments, some real pathos in the tragedy of Doctor Strange. But while I like a lot of things thematically in his character arc, he never quite comes alive for me. By the end, the movie becomes a somewhat typical and rushed origin story that doesn't quite manage to mix action spectacle, character-driven narrative, and educating the uninitiated about Doctor Strange's atypical, mystical world. I'm giving Doctor Strange the Sorcerer Supreme a 2.5 out of 4.